Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivana and Sam.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Transformation in Trials. Today, we're really pleased to have on the show Andreas Dam, who is CEO and founder of the agency Daman. And we're going to be zooming in on the topic of patient empowerment in clinical trials and how pharma can come closer to patients and HCPs. Hi, Andreas. Great to have you on the show.
Hi, guys. Great to be here.
So, Andreas, we'll get into your background and a bit about Daman as we get into the episode. But I wondered if you could start us off by answering this question. Could you talk to us about how pharma has typically engaged with healthcare professionals and patients in the past, and give us your perspective on how this might be changing going forward?
Yes, surely. It's a good question. So with my 20 years of experience in this field, I've seen that pharma has typically been very engaged with the HCPs and seeing them as their customers. And I think because historically it has been the doctors prescribing and deciding which treatments to use. Now, what we have also seen in society and in other industries, we have seen this consumerization going on for quite a long time. And this is also happening in healthcare, meaning that whenever I get some disease or some of my relatives will get a disease, I don't just lean back and expect my doctor and the system to fix me. So it's this consumerization or empowerment that we see is going on. And historically, pharma has not been really close to patients, but that is shifting now because patients can be relevant for two main directions, two macro trends we see. Either the direction of the end consumer having a bigger say, having a part of the decision in terms of treatment, that makes the end consumer, you could say, interesting and relevant to pharma. Or the other macro direction that we might see heading is more of a payer, more power to the payer, you could say, but they are very much driven by data and looking towards what outcomes are we getting from this treatment versus that treatment. And that calls for new types of data that's typically very closely related to patients' everyday life and how they are able to live their life, take part in society, and so on. So those are the main big drivers for pharma being more and more engaged closely to patients.
Awesome. And practically, how are pharma addressing this change? How are they getting closer to patients? Anything that you're seeing in particular?
Yes, so I think every pharma nowadays, they have a slogan or a saying of being patient-centric. Now, with that being said, in my experience, it's very, very different how good we are at walking that talk, you could say. So some pharmas remain still more traditionally approaching market, and some are more innovative or forward-thinking and really looking at the end users as their most important customers and seeing how they can actually not only deliver advanced innovative treatment into market, but also can help solve some of the other challenges that remain in our healthcare system, whether that is part of patients' everyday life. For instance, more and more patients are in a chronic setting. So that calls for a continuous good management, self-management, dealing with the disease, where medicine is, of course, one part, but there are many other parts to that. And then also the general change in how we interact as patients with the healthcare setting and so on. So, for instance, also within clinical trials, we see more and more application of patient-reported outcomes into the trial designs. And that's because pharma, they also acknowledge that in future when they're going to seek approval or go through different bodies to get their treatment into market, they will be asked about what outcomes, how are you really impacting quality of life, how are you extending lives, and so on with this treatment. There's also another interesting perspective that we see now in pharma's acknowledgement of, let's say, one of the tricky parts of doing clinical trials is this artificial setting. And there is also a term called ecological momentary assessment, which is about that you answer differently when you're asked in clinic, in hospital, versus if you are at home in your home setting. And this is what we are trying to come around with the technologies we provide, with these digital health solutions that can help capture daily or close to daily real world evidence around how you're doing.
No, that's really interesting. What are the typical differences seen, just building on that point that you raised, in terms of data being captured at home versus another location? What kind of differences do you typically see, and what's the problem here?
So there are two problems to this. One is that our minds are programmed to forget about bad periods of life because that's how we survive and cope well. So having to give, how have you been doing the last month, 3 months, 6 months when you're in the clinic, that's very hard for us to do that. The second point towards this with ecological momentary assessment, that's about that you answer differently because maybe you see your doctor running around, or maybe you get sort of impacted in your state, in your emotional state, psychological state when you are in the clinic. So you might be saying, well, I'm actually doing quite fine, but it might not actually be the case. So we see that that we as human beings, we have a tendency to look more towards the positive side when we're in the clinic. And you could say fundamentally it's a really fantastic human thing, but it doesn't necessarily bring the actual view on how we have been doing and how we are doing also in the right moment.
No, that's really fascinating. And do you have a perspective on the whole, obviously collecting data from patients? You can collect that data via some kind of device, and it's based on a questionnaire, for example. However, perhaps collecting data from a patient that's even less invasive to their daily lives and activities might also be interesting, and it could potentially remove some of that variance that you just talked to in terms of a patient maybe answering differently because they're at site. And I'm talking more about, I don't know, continuously collecting data from a wearable device or something like that.
Yeah. So that's also, for instance, now we are applying our software technology platform in combination with a medical device, which is it's a smart watch where it's collecting data like sleep data, activity data, and so on. So there we get more sort of, you could say, objective data points in, and it's also belonging to the category what we call passive data. Because Sam, you have a really good point here as well, not to overwhelm or overburden patients with having to fill out patient-reported outcome questionnaires every day containing 200 different questions. So this is also where we see changes that pharma is involving the patients and having the patients say more into the actual design of these clinical trials and what sort of outcome measures we apply or include in these trials. So here we have very successfully taken part with our co-creation methodology, where patients are really closely involved in the design and the setup of the study, and not just as subjects participating in the actual execution of the trial.
I think it's really interesting because I can think, even from a personal standpoint, outside of the realms of a clinical trial, I've worn a activity tracker, and it takes some other biometric measurements called a Whoop band. I don't know if you've come across Whoop, but within Whoop, there's the option to also fill in a diary. And even though the diary is kind of multiple choice, I find if there's too many questions, I just answer whatever basically to get that question away. However, the real value I get is from the actual continuous data collection and the patterns that I see over time and the impact of things like sleep on performance. I just find that really valuable.
I'm just curious, Andreas, maybe you could tell us more about this methodology that you mentioned for how you develop some of these tools for life science companies.
Yes, surely. So co-creation, that's a method for user-driven innovation. And it is really about, let's say, us, for instance, at Daman, stepping away from having all the answers and being the experts and knowing exactly what the patients need, but more facilitating a process where we let patient and healthcare professionals sort of be co-designers. So we have seen, I would say, 2-3 really strong benefits of that. First of all is going from problem to solution. There are many different roads or tracks you can do. We're typically quite good at understanding patients' needs or problems. However, there are many D routes potentially that you end up going in towards a certain solution. And secondly, what we have seen in our healthcare system is that in order to implement new innovative services, it's really important to have both healthcare professionals, but also patient organizations and so on deeply involved. And we have seen that co-creation really fosters this kind of KOLs finding themselves as the mothers and fathers of what we are inventing here. And that's a really strong thing when you are working to implement these and letting them become a part of standard clinical practice and so on. And then thirdly, also, if you are in the pharmaceutical industry, there might sometimes be thinking among the HCPs, like what's the back thought of this from pharma, or what's like the commercial agenda here, or things like that. And you kind of get everything on the table, and there's nothing hidden when you're doing co-creation from the very early stage, involving both patients and healthcare professionals.
What's stopping pharmaceutical companies adopting that methodology across the board? Is it budget and maybe short-term thinking versus long-term thinking? Because perhaps they're thinking they have to invest time and money up front versus, I don't know, thinking about it from a long-term standpoint. Because when I hear you explain it, it sounds like common sense, but then it begs the question, why wouldn't we do it all the time?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so really good question. I think there are a number of reasons to it. I think if we talk from a macro, the bigger picture first, the business model of pharma is often still the traditional model, right? So you are not really seeing a huge disruption yet of this business model. I think what can accelerate this journey is a shift towards pharma being paid per pill, towards being paid for the actual outcomes. So if you're not paid by the number of prescriptions and the use of a certain drug, but you are still paid of how much do we cure or how much do we lift these patients' quality of life, that really accelerates the business drivers overall for pharma to be more end user customer centric. So that's on the bigger scale. Then on a more practical scale, these pharma companies are of course very huge organizations, and there are really innovative thinkers and innovative teams, but they still end up in the same regulatory, legal, quality kind of framework. So that is sometimes tricky for them, and we are also still bound by this legal aspect that pharma cannot really interact directly with patients, right? So you have to make a setup where this flies, and that's of course where we as a company also is often sort of the man in the middle there to facilitate these processes.
And Andreas, I'm curious about that. How much are we required to keep a distance to patients, and how much is it that we're just used to not engaging with patients at all? How much is dogma and how much is actually regulation?
So I think you can still be very close despite the regulation that we are under. And I think that's mainly back to our traditional way of operating as pharma and so on, right? And so I think a lot of people in pharma and many of them, they really want to help the patients. It's not so much about selling a lot of drugs. It's really having an impact out there. So I think there is willingness, and then there of course still are internal structures that can sometimes limit this let's say speed of innovation and so on. And speaking of that, I think another thing that we are seeing now is big pharma maybe reconsidering their approach to being innovative, because when you come out of a drug life cycle kind of thinking, you think really, really long term and so on. But for instance, with software, with innovative digital health services, it's the other way around. You need as quick as possible to bring your first prototype or minimal viable product out to some patients, start testing it in a small group, and then you iterate and iterate and iterate. And eventually, when you iterate a lot with the market, with the users, whether it's patients or doctors, you end up with a great product. So getting that mindset in is also what we see is going on. You could call it it's not just a digital transformation, I would say. It's also more a market or patient focus transformation that's going on in parallel to the digitalization and so on.
What about, so we focused a fair bit on patients. What about the other healthcare providers or people that work at site? Because I feel that they're often a group that potentially overlooked. Do you have any experiences around that, Andreas, or perspective on that topic?
Yeah, so what I would say, at least in general, is that I have myself a technical background, but I am out of a healthcare family, and I can just see how everybody I know in the healthcare system, they run so fast, and there's a lot of challenges with people being burned out and so on. And people also, for instance, here in Nordics, we see people leaving the let's say the public sector in terms of healthcare to get a job in a private clinic or something like that, simply because the speed, the workload, the satisfaction of doing a good job is just not matching with what is a nice work environment, right? So I think in general, we have a huge job to take really good care of all the amazing people that eventually will help us all when we are hit by some disease in our lives. And there we have a huge job to do. And again, back to where our experience is most is seeing how can patients be more self-managed, how can we help them be more empowered, so they are maybe not calling the nurse in the clinic as many times. Maybe we can skip certain fixed frequency consultations, follow-ups that you are typically having when you have a chronic disease, because then we can redistribute the resources inside our healthcare system. And hopefully we can also make it more satisfiable to all these people that work in our healthcare system, so we don't risk that they are going to leave or they will be burned out. And also looking towards future, we live longer and longer, which is fantastic. But it also means that we are living with maybe not just one, but multiple chronic conditions in the future. And we can simply not afford, and we do not have the capacity to serve these needs in a traditional manner like we do today. So I really see no other cause than accelerating the use of these new technologies, whether it's AI and data-driven or it's more digital self-management. I really, really see that we need the speed to go up. And luckily, the pandemic has also made us progress a lot in terms of more simple technology like telemedicine and so on. So I think we have a really good foundation to continue applying and implementing these new technologies into our healthcare system.
And I'm curious, Andreas, do you have some examples of how some of these digital health tools can support chronic patients and maybe help them manage their disease?
Yes, so I can talk a little bit from some of the own examples. So we have this digital health patient empowerment platform called HealthBuddy, and we run a number of different solutions in different therapeutic areas. So one example of one of our services is a tool called RheumaBuddy. It's for people with rheumatoid arthritis. And here we help patients to get a better insight on themselves in terms of how actually the disease is impacting them and their quality of life, and also how their lifestyle is potentially impacting the disease. RA is a disease where you can have really good stable periods, and then suddenly you might have a flare-up. So it fluctuates, and it's a dynamic disease. So understanding these insights yourself is really important. And there we also give the people with RA access to a closed community, a peer-to-peer community. So what we see is that a lot of people with a chronic condition, they have sort of figured a lot of stuff out themselves. And when you pool that together in a community, when you share that, it's a really, really huge opportunity for people to exchange, life hacks from very small practical things to overall, how do you cope with constantly having pain? How do you cope with such a thing as fatigue? And how can you manage still to have a pretty normal daily life, despite that this fatigue is often there? And then what we also help with in these solutions is how can you really have an optimal touch point when you are for a checkup, a consultation with your doctor? Because often it's not so often, and you have very little time, and you can be fully assured that if you don't enter the room in the right way and put your agenda on the table, the doctor will drive the agenda and spend the time on things that he or she believes is important to you. So this also talks to that we are also supporting this principle of shared decision making, where you as a patient, you are expert in living your life with this disease, and the doctor is the medical expert. And it's living those two roles in a good way. Then you can really do a really, really good collaboration between you and the doctor. Another example is within cancer, where we have developed and deployed a solution here in Denmark for young people with cancer, which helps them to be, again, more empowered and so on. And what we have seen from clinical trials there is that normally when you're diagnosed with cancer, you, of course, have a huge drop in quality of life because it's just a complete game changer and shock to your existential being. And there we have seen with our solutions, with our solution, we are able to avoid the big drop, but we have just a smaller drop in terms of quality of life. And also, so luckily, a lot of these young people with cancer, they actually survive. So when they are sort of exiting the hospital and when they are sort of cured for now, there's typically a huge drop again in quality of life because you are sort of left to yourself. And there we have also seen that with our solution, we have a lower drop in quality of life. So those are some of the examples that we have seen. And the really exciting thing is that there's a lot going on in this space currently globally. So it's really interesting times to see what, where the future goes.
They're awesome examples. I really love the whole community component of what you described there. I just think it's so important. Like humans throughout the generations have always wanted to collaborate and be part of something, and people often talk about technology kind of driving a wedge through those types of interactions, but it sounds like in actual fact it's making those interactions even more seamless.
The thing is also it's small things, right, that can help you. I mean, so we also talk to what we call micro interventions that can have a macro effect. But a small trick to something that has really been a hassle to you, knowing that from somebody else living with the disease can have a huge make a huge difference to you, or maybe realizing that you should speak differently to your doctor about your side effects. That will enable the doctor actually to maybe adjust your dosing on the medication or put you on other medication that is actually gonna have a huge difference to your life and your quality of life in your daily setting. So definitely there is a huge opportunity there.
And I think you also have the dual kind of impact of the person that gives the advice feels good about giving advice, and the person that receives it gets to benefit from that advice. And it's kind of this evolving organic kind of process where everybody kind of wins from it, which is great.
And that's a really good point, Sam, because most people that have gone through, let's say, a shitty period of life with their disease, they just want to avoid that others have to go through the same thing, right? So people are really, really, when they have a little bit of, let's say, energy, or they are not themselves, really struggling, they just want to give back to others so that others don't have to go through the same as they just did. So there's a really good matching between wanting to help and the need for help there.
Yeah, and transformation in trials, we have a pretty broad audience, but we do have quite a strong bias from technologists. So maybe you could go a bit deeper on some of the technology that kind of facilitates some of the concepts that you just described, just to scratch the itch of that side of our audience anyway.
Exactly, yeah. So what we have recently built into our platform is what we call a recommender engine. And that is based on different data sets. So we have our own data set from our digital health services. So it's the patient that's reporting data, and it's the passive data that can come from wearables and so on. And that we combine with routine clinical data. So that's more like what you have in your electronic medical record or what you have in a patient registry. And then we combine it also with socioeconomic data. And that enables us to give some, you could say, intelligent guidance back to the individual. To give you a very practical example, when you have rheumatoid arthritis, we can see from your data what sort of activity level is good for you in order to keep your pain level down, for instance. So we can advise you that, well, Sam, for you, it's actually good if you can walk between 4,000 and 6,000 steps a day, because that seems to keep your pain at the lowest level. And there we can also look across other people's data and so on. So that's just some practical examples how we apply this. And this is also where, so I mean, even when I was back in university, we talked about artificial intelligence, but now we're really seeing these advanced methods being applied in healthcare. So we can use machine learning and deep learning, for instance, in our recommender engine to deliver really, really good personalized health back towards the patients.
So that sounds great. And you've kind of alluded to some of your background already, Andreas, the whole medical connection, and then what you were doing at university. But maybe this is a good segue into providing us with a bit more of an understanding as to you and your background, and then how you formed Daman, etc., and what you're working on at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes. So my background is in computer science and engineering. But I very quickly, after I graduated from the university, I figured out that it was not so much to me about the technology, but also often how we, let's say, match people and people's need with the technology. I started also working in the pharmaceutical industry, and in the early days of Daman, we were much an agency, I would say, helping pharma companies to push their drugs better to market and so on. But at some point in time, that didn't really kind of motivate me so much to get up early in the morning and do my thing. So there we actually just adjusted the purpose of Daman towards helping people, in particular people with chronic conditions, live better lives. And our really North Star now is to improve the quality of life of people with chronic conditions so they can have the same quality of life as if they did not have their disease. And as part of this, we have also formulated that we want to drive this transition in the pharmaceutical industry, because pharma is such a huge and important player in the healthcare ecosystem. So we really try to make pharma more patient-centric and digital in order to help with these needs that still remain there. And I think also we can look at healthcare as we've come really far in a number of treatment areas in terms of really good medicine that is sort of helping people to live quite good lives. But the next level is really more holistically looking at how can we help patients, even though they are maybe medically well treated, how can we help them also to live a good life? How can we help them to be able to have a job and be attached to the job market? How can we help them raise their family and being social in a way that's also gonna let us have a good future with those new generations that will come.
And Andreas, I'm just curious, where in the pharmaceutical life cycle would you usually come in? Would it be in the clinical stages already? Is it for mainly addressing patients that are getting approved treatments? Where would Daman fit in?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? And I laugh a little bit because it's, of course, in general, very much inside out thinking when we talk about that pharmaceutical life cycle, because it's not necessarily the life cycle of patients and their journey with their disease and treatments and so on. We are mainly part of the, let's say, pre-launch or launch in the commercial area. But we've also started to work, let's say, earlier. So, for instance, in phase 3 trials, we can also apply our technology platform to enrich with all the data. And what we hope in future is even to make some partnerships with pharmaceuticals where we can bundle our technology, this type of digital intervention to help better coping and self-management, combined with new innovative treatments. So I would say those are the primary areas. But of course, even with sort of the real-world evidence data that we capture in some of our solutions, even for very early, let's say, R&D discussions in pharma, it can be relevant to look at what are sort of the remaining unmet needs. So you can, of course, start from the molecule level and look at what innovation or magic do we think we can do there. I really also believe in starting looking at, okay, what are still unmet needs and what do we foresee are going to be unmet needs 10 years, 15 years down the line, and taking that into consideration as well. Because there is really, really still a huge job to be done for helping people with disease live better lives.
With this more holistic type approach, Andreas, does your potential customer broaden to maybe government if you're starting to impact socio-economic outcomes? Then obviously the pharma industry has a vested interest in that, but government does, as does kind of every individual in a given country. So yeah, is the world your oyster in terms of who your potential customer can be?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely also governments. It can be insurance companies in some markets. It's also medtech and so on. I really still think that pharma, and there's also often talk about what about big tech players, right? Are they going to enter and disrupt the healthcare and so on? I really, really still think that pharma is going to have a really dominant position. And therefore, I think also the opportunity is really huge there. But of course, we do see some countries, for instance, in Germany and France, where they're introducing app reimbursement programs, where they have programs for digital therapeutics and so on. So to us, that's also a journey looking at, but we still hope that we can make strong partnerships with pharma, even in a joint bundle or in a go-to-market approach. Because pharma has a really strong network of people interacting with all the clinics, doctors, nurses, and so on a daily basis in every country.
Okay, Andreas. Well, we always ask our guests the same questions towards the end. And that is, if you could change one thing in the life science industry, what would that be?
That's a good question. So maybe I'm not answering your question in the right way, in the sense that I think if there could be a fundamental transitioning of business models away from this, let's say, delivering drugs towards this more holistic evaluation, I think we would put some incentives to pharma to transition their businesses that could have a huge impact on you and me and every citizen of this world that will at some point also be a patient in our healthcare system.
Awesome. Well, Andreas, I've personally really enjoyed this discussion and taken a lot away from it. I think our audience members will have done so too. And if people are curious to learn more about both what you do and what Daman's up to, where's the best place for them to come and find you?
Yeah, you can, of course, go on our website, damandigital.com. I would also encourage us to connect on LinkedIn and have a chat and conversation there, because there are a lot of really awesome people in this fantastic social media platform. And I think we can interact there. And that's where we can ignite this transformation and acceleration towards a better future of our healthcare system together.
I 100% agree. Andreas, thank you.
Thank you.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have a suggestion for a guest for our show, reach out to Sam Parnell or Ivana Rosendahl on LinkedIn. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or in any other player. Remember to subscribe and get the episodes hot off the editor.